This course is a course on church history. And that seems obvious enough, church history, the history of the church. But it's actually not. The problems emerge from the very beginning, the very posing of the concept of church history. What is the church? What is history? So our typical way of discussing church history is that we tell a story of the church within the world. So the way to imagine this maybe is perhaps that the history of the world is like a field, like a playing field, a soccer field or something like that. And there's a bunch of players on the field moving, maneuvering, competing with each other. And these players could be corporations, ideologies, companies, individuals. And the church, we imagine it as just being one of those players. So the church, which is the home of this religious stuff, is playing on this world of the secular, right? This sort of field that isn't itself the church, but it's just the place where the church operates. And so that enables us to tell a story of the church within that world that doesn't implicate the whole world, right? So we can have a direct sort of a play-by-play account of what moves the church made and what other players made and how it worked. But we could easily imagine the church just being pulled off the field and the game continues without it. This idea is almost entirely wrong as an analogy for church history. In fact, you almost want to flip it completely on its head and imagine instead that the field is the church. The field is humanity, and the movement from the fall to redemption is the game that's being played. And so the players on the field, it's still the corporations and the companies and the countries, and we can still have those players on the field, but they're no longer playing a game that involves the church as another player. Rather, the game itself is the game of salvation history, the game of redemption. The church is fundamental, not secondary. So where do we get in this idea that the church has a separate history, right? Well, there's several mistakes, major sort of fundamental errors that are made right from the get-go. One of them is the idea that's widespread even among Christians, it's more or less universal, which is that the world is divided into two tidy and distinct realms. You have the religious realm on one side and you have the secular on the other. And so the religious realm is often what we think of as includes supernatural things. So it's the realm of religion, it's the realm of God, of prayer, of heaven, of miracles, this sort of a realm. And it's a place that has primarily to do with our private life. It has to do with our personal happiness, with our reflective sort of well-being. And then that realm it takes place within this other realm, which is we call the secular, which means something like in time, and that's basically what we mean by it. And that realm, the secular realm, is the realm of everything that happens kind of outside the realm, the private realm. So that realm includes politics, it includes economics, it includes everything, the space, basically, within which the religious realm operates. Okay, you're just going about your daily life, and then a miracle happens. No, that's a religious thing. You're just going about your daily life, and then you get maybe stirred by a sermon, and you get motivated to adjust your private life somewhere, your morality. Oh, that's a religious thing, right? So these religious things are kind of intervening in the secular here or there. And their ultimate goal of the religious stuff is to get you to heaven, which is someplace that happens outside of the secular. So even the end, or the sort of objective of the religious, is not itself a part of the secular. The secular just kind of trucks along according to its own rules and its own laws, right? One human lifetime after the next, one event after the next. And the religious is operating in it or above it, but we could easily imagine the religious going away and the secular just is still there, just the way it is. It doesn't need the religious. Now, this is almost completely wrong. In fact, it is just simply and completely wrong. In fact, Christianity is not about our private lives, and it's not merely about where we go after we die. Christianity is about everything in the cosmos, everything in the cosmos. There's nothing that isn't involved in the story of Christ. And the cosmos is temporal, right? The cosmos is moving through time. So that concept of the secular, that time-bound stuff, is the realm of the church. The church is in time, and it is secular in that sense, fundamentally. So when we say Christianity is inherently temporal, when I say it's inherently temporal, I mean that Christianity is in time in the same sort of way that you or I are in time, right? So if we ask the question, who are you? Who am I? We immediately, in order to answer that question, really answer it, we have to start telling a story about ourselves. Where have we been? What choices have we made? What are your regrets, your dreams? These are the things that make us who we are. And all of those are inherently temporal. They have to do with change over time. However, it's not an absolute change over time, right? Because the very context of asking that question is that there's a you that you're telling the story about, a you that persists through time. There's a you that was there when you're a baby, a you that's there when you're in prime, a you on your deathbed, and a you that will exist for eternity. There's something that reaches past time, even though it's fully within time. That's your soul. So the church is like this when we say the church is temporal. It is entirely in time, and yet it reaches beyond time. But we have to not think because we have those two realms that we separate them. That doesn't make sense. That's not what we need to fight against that with all of our intellectual being here. So like how our soul and our body are intimately connected, so the thing that reaches beyond time, the thing that's in time to make us who we are, the church is like that. The supernatural bits, the religious bits, and the natural bits, the sort of secular bits that we think of are both intimately bound within the church, like the soul and the body, making it what it is. This should, of course, remind us of the Eucharist, or even more profoundly, to the incarnation of Christ himself. And when we think about that, we start to see how it is. We start to approach the mystery of the church as the body of Christ. But in order to really understand that, really unpack that mystery, we have to address a second modern error, which is the modern tendency to view the world through the lens of individualism. We tend to imagine the world as a whole sea of individuals, more or less self-sufficient individuals going about their business, making their decisions, living their lives, according to their own wills and pursuing their own motivations. Now, these individuals sometimes come together for various purposes. They could come together for political purposes, like defending themselves against violent men. They could come together for economic purposes, maybe to trade goods or to form some sort of a business corporation. They could come together for private reasons, like maybe a romantic relationship. But the point is, in all of those sort of scenarios, what we're imagining are self-sufficient individuals that are combining with other self-sufficient individuals after the fact of their individuality, right? So there's a sequence. First, we're by ourselves and we're individual, then we join up socially. This is the error of individualism. It's almost entirely wrong as well. So individuals are, in fact, born into social worlds. We are who we are in our core, in a society. The other people in our lives are a part of who we are intrinsically. So this is what I mean when I say something like human beings are social in our nature. We don't mean we like society. We mean we are social. We're not human beings other than being social. So when we say we're social in our nature, it's similar to saying we're rational in our nature, right? What distinguishes a human being from a dog? We're rational, the dog isn't. So we are, in our relationships, us. That's who we are. So we only exist as full persons in relation to other persons. That's what it means to be a person. And this is a hard idea for us. We have individualism so embedded into our minds that it's hard for us to even kind of wrap our minds around this. But we have certain analogies that can help us see it. For example, the analogy of a mother and her son. Right, when we say someone is a mother, when we say mother, the concept of child is in the word. You can't be a mother without the child. The converse is the same. You can't be the son or the daughter without the concept of mother. What it means to be a son or a daughter is that you have a mother. They require each other to be what they are. So this way of thinking is the way we are in our natures, in our social natures. And this is, again, like the church, or the church is like this. The church is social fundamentally. The church is a society of persons who are united together in this sort of fundamental way. But they're not just united together, they're also united to Christ in this sort of a fundamental way, in his humanity and his divinity. So the church is human beings in fundamental relationship with God, with Christ. And this we sometimes get at by talking about the church as the bride of Christ. Because if you think about the analogy of mothers and sons, the analogies of brides and grooms works in the same sort of way. What it means to be a groom is to have a bride. What it means to be a bride is to have a groom. In fact, the Bible is so insistent on this point that it talks about brides and grooms becoming one flesh, having one body, not being distinct, or they're distinct within their unity. So again, this is why we sometimes talk about the church as the bride of Christ. But talking about the church as the bride of Christ is not a different analogy than talking about the church as the body of Christ. Brides and grooms have one body. The church is the bride of Christ. It's the body of Christ. You see how they fit together. So we're social fundamentally, and this society includes Jesus Christ. This is the church. So we might say the church then one way to think of it is the church is the redeeming of humanity through time, all of humanity, and with humanity, the cosmos. But another way of saying it is the church might be the redeeming of humanity. The church is the activity of the redemption of man in time, and that helps us get the temporal into the idea of the church. It's an action. The church is something that's happening. So in the incarnation, human nature was perfectly united to the divine. Now, in the church, this unity remains. The church is really the continuation of Christ's incarnational mystery. In fact, St. Thomas and others have gone so far as to say that the establishment of the church was the mission of Christ. That's why he came. So the church is fundamentally temporal, the church is fundamentally social, it is fundamentally human, and yet it reaches beyond this to the eternal. It's also divine. So the church, when we talk about the church saving us, we mean it saves us, as men and women in the world, in this temporal stream. Not us as extracted out of that context, not some sort of hypothetical us that gets to go to heaven after this world passes away or something like that. So the church does not wait for us to die to save us. Christ begins the saving work now, in time, here. God created the world in the beginning, which we'll talk about later, to be in union with him. The union was broken in sin, and the church is the reunion of man and God. The church, then, is the place where the particular, where the here and now is mysteriously united to the universal, to the all times and all places. And that's really what this whole lecture series is about, that reuniting of the particular with the universal. So this topic, of course, is endless, it's infinite. And so any sort of treatment of it has to pick and choose what we're going to talk about, and that's going to be no different here. I focus here on the Latin Church. I focus with a particular sort of narrative arc, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But one of the things that people will notice maybe most significantly is I'm going to focus here on politics. And this is typical, this is normal. History is normally written about politics. It's normally written about the great men and great events, battles and generals and presidents and all of that sort of thing. That's normally the content of history. And here, we're actually going to pretty much stick to that tradition. Politics, though, most generally understood, is the science or the reality of human beings living together. So you can see within the description of the church that I just gave, there's no such thing as politics other than the church, and there's no such thing as the church other than politics. So this isn't a real compromise on my part. Okay, so other things about this series. Typically, the church histories are told as histories of the clergy. They're often, tragically, as just histories of the papacy. We won't make that mistake, right? The laity are fully and completely parts of the church. And in fact, all of humanity is parts of the church in one degree or another, and ought to be in a perfect sense. So what that means is that when we tell this story, we're not going to pretend like you have, within the confines of Europe, say, of Christendom, we're not going to pretend like we have the church on one side, which is like the Pope and the priests that are loyal to him, and then the world on the other, which is made up of all the kings and nobles and knights and the laity, and then act like they're fighting and something, and the church did this and the nobles did this. The nobles are the church. They're the baptized laity. The church fights with itself often, tragically. The plot that we're going to have here is really the rise and fall of Christendom. So as for the characters in this story, St. Augustine described explained to us centuries ago, that there's really only two. There's the city of man and the city of God. So the city of man is made up of the communities that are aiming down. So if we think about the whole dynamic of church history is fall and redemption. So you have the city of man as the fallers, the falling ones, right? So they're aiming down to the merely temporal, to trying desperately to find happiness in that which they control simply. And these are many, many communities that together constitute the city of man. And then they are in conflict, fundamental conflict with the city of God. And the city of God is made up of all the communities that through receiving the grace of God are moving upwards, aiming up to find their happiness in union with him, in that which they don't control, and that which escapes their grasp, that which is the aspect of the temporal that's reaching into the eternal. That's their movement. Now, the story of history is the story of the conflict between these two. And by rights, the church is just the city of God. The city of God is the church in its sort of purity. But the institutional church, the visible church, the church of the baptized, is not simply the city of God in history, but rather the two cities are intermingled. And so you both have the godly sort of reaching out of the institutional church, and the fallen, or the city of man, kind of its little tentacles reaching into the institutional church. And so there's conflict within the church that mirrors the conflict that's going on in history itself. Or another way of saying is the history of the world as a whole and the history of the church are the same history. Now, the rise and fall of Christendom is the sort of framework for this, but there's these lectures, but there's no sense here that that's the end of history. In fact, I think it would be the height of foolishness to suppose that the fall of Christendom is anywhere close to the end. The church is only now breaking free from the confines of Europe. I suspect instead that this will just be the first chapter in a much, much longer story. These lectures will span from creation all the way until today. And we're going to move all the way through telling this story of the two cities and their conflict.